Control at sea often appears strongest when movement remains fluid. Ships travel where coastlines allow, supplies arrive through open routes, and distant settlements stay connected through maritime corridors. Yet the same openness that gives sea powers their reach gradually imposes a different constraint. The more extensively a maritime system depends on distant routes, the more its stability relies on maintaining uninterrupted movement across spaces that cannot be permanently secured. Initiative at sea rarely disappears through sudden defeat. It slows through accumulation. Routes lengthen, supply networks widen, and the effort required to maintain coordination grows heavier than the movement that once created advantage. By the time the change becomes visible, the system that produced mobility has already anchored itself to distances it cannot shorten. What began as freedom of movement gradually becomes dependence on it. The geography surrounding maritime powers rarely consists of a single coastline. Instead, it forms an uneven rim of peninsulas, island chains, narrow straits, and open basins that stretch across large distances. Consider the long arcs of coast surrounding the Atlantic world, from the fjords of northern Europe to the harbors of Iberia. The shoreline breaks into inlets that shelter fleets, but also fragment movement. Across the ocean, river mouths open inland corridors that pull cargo toward continental interiors. Between these coasts lies an expanse of water thousands of kilometers wide, shaped by prevailing winds that move vessels along predictable seasonal patterns. Farther south, the tropics impose their own limits, where storms reorganize shipping lanes and force vessels into temporary pauses. Maritime corridors therefore emerge not as straight crossings, but as networks shaped by currents, weather windows, and narrow passages between land masses. These corridors become the pathways along which cargo, labor, and communication gradually align. Movement along these routes initially compresses distance. A port positioned near favorable winds can dispatch ships rapidly across open water. Cargo moves outward through branching lines, reaching distant coasts that once required long overland journeys. Timber, grain, and metals pass through harbors where ships wait only briefly before departing again. The system appears light and flexible, yet every repeated route gradually produces fixed points. Ships require repair. Cargo must pause before transfer. Harbors deepen channels, extend docks, and construct warehouses to handle growing traffic. What begins as temporary staging gradually hardens into infrastructure. Shipyards appear where vessels frequently anchor for maintenance. Storage. Districts expand where goods accumulate before redistribution. Workers adjust to these rhythms. Dock labor organizes around arrival cycles determined by wind patterns rather than local clocks. Sailmakers, rope makers, and carpenters cluster near harbors, where fleets require constant maintenance. When storms delay convoys, workers shift tasks, repairing hulls or sorting cargo until sailing resumes. The system continues moving, but the places where it pauses begin to thicken with activity. As maritime networks extend farther outward, the intervals between these fixed points lengthen. A vessel leaving one harbor may travel weeks before reaching the next major port capable of repair or resupply. Provisions must therefore expand to cover longer stretches of open water. Barrels of fresh water and preserved food fill more of the hold. Cargo adjusts accordingly. Further inland, settlements receiving maritime goods begin adapting their own routines. Farmers adjust planting schedules to align with expected shipments of imported grain or tools. Carters wait along port roads for vessels whose arrival depends on wind systems hundreds of kilometers away. If storms delay convoys, warehouses remain sealed while inland markets stretch remaining supplies across uncertain weeks. Over time, the maritime network thickens with obligations. Convoys begin traveling together for security and coordination. Supply ships accompany fleets carrying spare materials and provisions. The number of vessels moving through each corridor multiplies, yet their movement becomes increasingly synchronized with the same environmental cycles. At first, this synchronization improves efficiency. Ports anticipate arrivals and prepare labor accordingly. Storage facilities handle cargo in predictable waves. Shipbuilders expand yards, knowing that fleets will return along the same routes. But repetition introduces a different pressure. When many ships depend on identical passages and seasonal winds, congestion begins to appear in the narrowest corridors. Straits that once guided navigation gradually compress traffic into slow-moving sequences of vessels waiting for passage. Harbors fill with ships awaiting favorable weather or space along crowded docks. Maintenance demands grow as well. Hulls traveling long ocean distances suffer gradual wear from salt water, currents, and storms. Shipyards expand to handle the growing queue of vessels requiring repair. Timber shipments from forested regions move steadily toward these yards, tying inland resource networks to maritime maintenance cycles. The system continues outward. Distant stations emerge along coastlines where fleets require fresh water or food before continuing their voyages. Small settlements near these stations adapt to the rhythm of arriving ships. Wells are dug deeper. Storage sheds appear near beaches where cargo can be quickly transferred. Labor shifts from agriculture toward provisioning. Each extension appears manageable in isolation. A new harbor here, a supply station there. Yet collectively, they create a chain of dependencies stretching across thousands of kilometers of water. Distance converts coordination into delay. A storm in one region postpones departures that ripple across multiple routes. Ships arriving late compress schedules in downstream ports, where workers must unload cargo quickly to keep the system moving. When several delays accumulate, warehouses overflow while inland caravans wait for goods that have not yet reached shore. Gradually, the maritime system spends more energy maintaining its own circulation. Fleets travel not only to move cargo, but also to supply distant bases, repair stations, and convoy routes required to sustain earlier expansion. The sea itself does not resist this growth. It simply preserves the distances involved. Every additional corridor stretches the network farther from its core ports. Messages between stations require weeks to arrive. Supplies must anticipate needs long before they are known. In quiet ways, initiative begins to shift. Ships continue to sail, but their routes increasingly follow established circuits required to sustain the network. Fewer vessels remain available to explore alternative paths or respond quickly to new opportunities. Harbors once used as flexible departure points now operate as logistical hubs coordinating predictable flows. Dock workers notice the change indirectly. Cargo once arriving from varied directions now appears in standardized convoys. Repair schedules fill months in advance. Supply clerks record inventories not only for outgoing trade, but also for distant stations waiting across the ocean. Recognition eventually appears within the system itself. Observers chart the widening distances between ports, the growing tonnage dedicated to maintenance rather than exchange, the increasing number of ships moving only to sustain the routes already in place. Yet these realizations arrive within structures already fixed along coastlines and islands. Shipyards cannot relocate easily. Supply stations remain anchored to specific bays where fleets have long depended on fresh water. Inland transport networks feed resources toward these same maritime nodes. A question begins to surface beneath the surface activity. If maritime advantage once came from the freedom to move across open water, What happens when the network built to sustain that freedom becomes too extensive to move quickly at all? Across the ocean routes, the ships continue to depart. Workers still repair hulls beneath wooden scaffolds. Convoys assemble at harbor mouths, while captains wait for wind systems that determine when crossing is possible. Yet the distances remain unchanged, stretching between ports that now carry the weight of entire logistical chains. Movement persists, but much of it now sustains the routes themselves. And somewhere along those same coasts, where fleets once left harbors with little more than cargo and favorable wind, dock workers now watch long rows of vessels waiting their turn to depart, each one carrying provisions not only for trade, but for the maintenance of the sea's own expanding network. Subscribe to Timeless Questions to explore how history and human nature quietly shape us.